Hey everyone, welcome to the reboot of Research the News. So, hopefully, with this reboot, if you're longtime listeners from when we did this a couple years ago, last time it was just me. So, hopefully, this time it'll be a lot more exciting because, first off, we'll be other people here. And second, one of the things that was really frustrating for me last time when we did this was that I was trying very hard not to offend anybody. By that, I mean not sharing any of my personal beliefs. Because I feel like we've come to a point in society where you have to, no matter what you say, it's going to offend somebody. And what I've realized is that I've been pretty frustrated for a long time now, and I just don't really care anymore. I'm gonna frustrate people. It's gonna happen if you have discussions. But the key is that we have discussions. So I think that's one of the big things that I've been frustrated by is that we just tend to jump towards preformed conclusions, not listen to discussion. And I think the term problematic is thrown around a lot. And I think one of the most problematic things in public discourse is that we have all these final opinions, and we are just trying to find things that mold right into those opinions. And you'll hear me talk about this a lot, but that's cognitive dissonance. That's not an attack on anybody else. I have the same thing. When people come after an idea that I have a thought, I have a vision, and someone challenges that, my initial thought is, no, wait, no, it's my opinion. And it may be wrong, but I'm going to avoid it at first and try not to hear your opinion. So that's what we do. But the goal here is to have discussions about tough topics while remaining friends. I want to have fun while we're disagreeing. We want to be combative, or we want to be, positive, not combative, even when we disagree. The goal here is to go after ideas, not people. So I might say, hey, I think your idea is crazy, but I don't think you're crazy. I mean, although with that being said, I do have a co-host that I sometimes think is a little bit crazy. And I'm going to bring her on now. So, Gretchen.
That was
Welcome.
quite an intro.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've said before, I'm going to say why I wanted to have Gretchen on the show here. Gretchen is much different than I am politically in a lot of ways. We'll say that. But we have great conversations. But I also spent a day in IKEA with her, and I am typically a pretty even-keeled person and pretty low-key, and the amount of looks we got from giant laughter was funny. I mean, it's good. I like people who have different personalities, but she's more bubbly. Is that a word you would use,
Yeah.
Gretchen?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So Gretchen's going to be with me on a lot of these shows, and we just want to start out this episode before we get into our guest, talking a little bit about ourselves. We're not going to make this a long thing, but we want to give you guys a background of who we are. So I'm going to start out here, go over a little bit about my background, then I'll toss it off to Gretchen here. So this is me, Ray Abel. I'm the host of Research the News. So my background is I grew up not wealthy. I'll put it that way. I was on government health care before Obamacare was cool. I think I do a lot of traveling now, but my first flight wasn't until I was 24. I never saw an ocean until my early 20s. I vacation in Erie, PA every year. If you guys know Erie, shout out to Erie, Pennsylvania. But what I also learned from traveling is that I grew up American poor. I've spent time in parts of Colombia, in the slums of Medellin, and I've spent time in Cuba. And so when I used to say I was poor when I grew up, but now I just realized that it was poor by American standards. But other backgrounds on me, I started out with a very diverse elementary school. I actually went to 3 elementary schools in Penn Hills, Pennsylvania. I was 60% white. Then I went to junior high in Plum that was 92% white. And then I capped it off at high school with a 96% white population. But I don't actually know. I think I think 96 is low. I think it was more like 99. It was a very white school. But then I also worked in a nonprofit for a few years, Muscular Dystrophy Association, and there I was actually definitely in the minority from a gender perspective. So there were 15 employees in our district, and I was the only male. So it was a lot of females and just me, which made for some interesting situations. And then I worked in the north side of Pittsburgh for a while, an inner city nonprofit, worked primarily with African-American students, but there were kids of all races. But all that being said, I mean, I've been poor, I've been comfortable, I've been in non-diverse communities, I've been in places where I was the only person that looked like me. My story isn't black and white, and there's a lot more to it, but I don't want to bore you all with it. But there's a lot of nuance there, and I think that we've lost a lot of nuance in general with conversations, and that's what we want to change here. Because to summarize all that, when we lose nuance, we let the extremist views shape all of our narratives, and we don't want that to happen. So that's my background. Gretchen, I'm turning it over to you. Tell the viewers a little bit about yourself.
My name's Gretchen Hurd. I'm originally from Brookville, Pennsylvania, near Punxsutawney. Anybody that knows the groundhog, that was my neighbor.
Shout out to Phil.
And little fun fact, we named our dog Phil. His name was Emmerickville Phil instead of Punxsutawney Phil.
Nice.
But I grew up, actually, it's kind of interesting because I grew up poor, not poor, but we were not wealthy. And I think a lot of people thought we were. My father worked very, very hard. He worked in the natural gas, and he was a directional driller, and he worked his way up through the company. And so when I was very young, we had not a lot of money, but they never let us know that. We thought we were really, really doing great. And I didn't realize that anything was wrong until I was in my 20s and talked to my mom about what the situation really was with our family, and I had no idea. And so looking at my dad, how hard he worked and what his background was like and how he provided for us at his own ended up demise. He passed away 10 years ago of lymphoma due to working on natural gas wells. So a lot of my home life, I don't want to say it was like a utopia. I mean, we really did think we had the most amazing childhood. And I think it was really because of my parents and my mother, who worked when I was younger, gave up her career to stay home with us so my dad could work full time. I grew up in a very white area. In my hometown, we had one Black family, one Asian family, and one Indian family. And
just one family of okay.
One.
All right. Yeah.
And it was like, the Indian family, he was the doctor and one of the doctors. The Asian family, they ran the Chinese food restaurant. And one of the Black families, they were 2 years younger than me, a year younger than me, so they weren't even in my grade. So my
it sounds like a sitcom from like the early 2000s where you have to have a diversity, so they threw different families in just to like. I feel
like my entire life is like either a made-for-TV movie or like I was like the head cheerleader and I dated the quarterback of the football team. Like it was like that.
Humble brag. I like it. Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, growing up in that place, which I love my hometown and I love the people I went to school with, I think it really shaped whenever things were happening in that town and I was aware of it, it really did shape my views. When I moved, I went to Slippery Rock University and then I moved to Philadelphia. And then from there I moved to Pittsburgh, which is where I live now. And I'm a dancer, so I moved to Pittsburgh to perform with some big dance companies. And in that, worked with underprivileged kids in the inner city schools doing dance classes for them instead of gym classes. So I think being that kind of a positive influence through dance like really helped build my moral character, I think, and exposed me to places and people that I would have never, ever, ever gotten to experience where I grew up. So that's
why I dance. It's for the moral ability for me to help people. So,
and a little thing, I lived in West Virginia for 12 years, which was a whole other little culture shock. So,
shout out to West Virginia.
Right.
Yeah.
All over PA, down to West Virginia, and then back to Pittsburgh now. So,
So Joe Manchin, if you're listening, this is one of your former constituents. So, well, thank you, Gretchen, for that intro. At some point, I will maybe post a video of me and my interpretive dances I've done to help my moral code. So I'll show you at some point. But now we're going to introduce someone with the coolest name. When I talked to her this week, I actually thought she had a fake name. This is Sidni Standard, Sidni, so it's even spelled cool. But yeah, Sidni, welcome.
Thank you. It's cool to be on the show. It's so interesting hearing like your backgrounds and everything. My background is so completely different from both of you. Honestly, I grew up pretty privileged. I'm not going to lie. And the first time I traveled was when I was like 9 months out of the country. So
wow.
Where'd you go on your first trip out of the country?
Jamaica.
Oh, nice.
Sweet.
Nice.
My mom was born there. So we used to go every year until I was 8 years old. But yeah, no, I just think it's so interesting because I really didn't experience like super hardships until I decided to go off to San Francisco, and like there's no prior planning, nothing like that, And I just kind of went and I fell flat on my face. But I learned a lot and I interacted with people that I literally would have never interacted with before in my life, homeless people. And one of the things for me is like, I hate that there's so many people who are just forgotten. You walk past them every day on the street and people act like they care, but they don't even stop by to ask them how they're doing. So, yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. Actually, we'll have to talk sometime. I worked with a homeless nonprofit for about a year, and we did trips in Pittsburgh, and it was definitely eye-opening in a lot of ways. So very cool. And Sidni, before we get started, now that we heard a little bit about your background, our backgrounds, we're going to play a game that I'm calling What's Your Bias? And so we're going to talk today. One of the reasons Sidni is on the show here is because she's connected to Jody Shaw, which if you've been reading this week at all in the news, she's a former librarian from Smith College, and she left and wrote this letter to the school board and said why she was leaving, or the university board, and why she was leaving. And we'll get into what that's all about. But before we talk about that, we want to talk about our biases, because everyone has biases, and it's okay because we're humans. We're all going to be biased some way. And I think the important thing for this show is to be honest about where we're coming from. So I'll go first here and just talk about kind of my generic political biases. I, Ray, tend to be fiscally conservative, and what that means to me is not what you hear from either Republicans or Democrats at this point. I think now, I think the Republicans print slightly less money than the Democrats, but it doesn't mean it's well spent money. I think now it's all about buying votes. So for me, I'm not against social programs, which I think is kind of a common misconception about people who are fiscally conservative. I'm just against spending money poorly, whether it's in my personal life or the money I give to the government. And also, on a side note with that, I feel like everyone should have to pay their taxes at the end of the year, because we have a startup and I pay my taxes in one lump sum. And when you see how much you're actually paying, it's nuts. But that's beside the point. For the rest of where I'm at, I think I'd consider myself more libertarian than anything else. When it comes to social issues, as long as people aren't bothering other people, I don't really care what people do. And internationally, I just think we should stop bombing the Middle East. I think that'd be a good plan. It seems like all the time we're doing that. I don't know why. Just I've been around a little while now, and it's never really seemed to lead to anything good. So that's kind of where I'm from. Gretchen, you want to talk a little bit about your background, just briefly, where you're coming from? I just point out you are a part of Antifa. That's why you're on the show, because I wanted someone who was very far left. So.
No, but I am considered. Well, it's interesting. I consider myself a progressive. I love my friends who are gay, who are bisexual, who are trans. I have a lot of acquaintances, and it's just like we were talking about, like we're doing all this work and seeing people, and I care about everybody, so I want everybody to have amazing lives, and I know that I'm privileged just because of how I grew up and the opportunities that I had, and so I want everybody else to have those same opportunities. So I think that it's interesting, even like Ray, when you were just talking, I was like, I agree with you like 100%. And I think that's kind of the weird part, is we slap labels like this on ourselves, but I mean, I think we really all want the same things. Like, I don't like what we're spending money on, and I think I'm more fiscally moderate. I think that I'd like to see more social programs than subsidies for huge corporations, but and I think that's maybe where I consider myself a little bit more progressive. But
I can't wait to talk economics at some point. That's it's one of my favorite topics.
I will say too that I digest news every day, but I do not obsess over it. So I think that I try not to let it impact my daily life. So even though I have more progressive views, I try to keep it in check and not allow it to, because I was married and he obsessed about news. And so, I've talked about this with my mother. But she, it's like you become kind of what you're surrounded by. So, and that happened. So I think coming from that and swinging back and realizing who I am, which I'm still going through that process. So I've only been divorced now for 3 years. So I'm still figuring out who I am. So, and with coming into, the swings of political discourse, like my views are constantly changing, and I think that's good. I don't think
that is good. I think flip-flopping is one of the great myths that's necessarily a bad thing. We all we all switch our views. We get new information and we change our views.
Yeah.
Speaking of, I'd like to hear a little bit about your background, Sidni, because I think one of the things that interests me about you, should I just let you talk about your bias, or should I tell you one of the things that interests me about you?
You can start there.
Well, I think one of the things we talked about was that we're going to talk about critical race theory today, and I do want to hear later on a little bit about how you went from marching at Black Lives Matter protests in Boston to being an outspoken, would you say you're an outspoken critic of critical race theory? I
wouldn't say it's critical race theory. I just believe that humans are not their skin color. I think we're just so much more than that. And I think with critical race theory, it makes it so that the skin color is the most important thing. And I just think that's such a small aspect of an individual's identity.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Well, I think if you want to talk a little bit more about kind of your background and your biases, and then we're going to go into some of the questions here.
Yeah, so I kind of grew up and, I kind of went with the dominant narrative of okay, yeah, it's right to be a liberal and do all that stuff. So I kind of was just I'm doing that. And then after college and all that, I started to realize that a lot of those values aren't necessarily my values, because conservative values for me is more in alignment with just what has been modeled for me. I had the two parents in my house. Mm-hmm. I had my mom who was there when I was a child helping us. And so that's more conservative. And those are the values that I seem to hold. And especially with regard to what you said about conservative fiscally, I totally agree with that. I think a lot of times what we're spending money on federally doesn't really make sense. And I almost wish that money was going back to the people. So if people wanted to open an orphanage, the people themselves who really have their heart in it can have that extra money that they're not paying in taxes to actually create it.
I 100% agree. Yeah. All right. Well, I think, Sidni, when we do talk about economics, I want to have people in here that I disagree with, but I also want you to have my back when we talk about economics. So, but today I want to talk a little bit about critical race theory. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to give kind of the overview of critical race theory as I understand it. And then Sidni, I'm sure you probably know more about it than I do, so I'm going to let you tell me what I did wrong, and then talk a little bit about what happened with Jody Shaw and going into the rest of the show. We'll ask some questions, and we have a few viewers on Facebook. If anyone has a question for you, we can take those as well. But I want to start out. So basically, from what I understand, there's kind of four main pillars for critical race theory. Number one is that racism is normal, and it's not just how our society operates, but every dominant attitude is based in white supremacy. Intersectionality, and just to be clear too, when I say these are actually, this isn't, I feel like when I read them, they sound a little bit harsh, but it was actually taken from a Yale University video. It was a good overview, I thought, and it was actually from someone who was telling how we should be and what the problem was. It was a little weird though that the guy leading it was white and the two people listening to the presentation were black, and the white guy was telling the black people. It was just weird to me. But anyway, this is coming from someone, it's a liberal perspective here. So intersectionality means no person has a single identity. So me as a cis white male, I have a lot of privilege, and when you start getting into Gretchen as a woman, but she's a white woman, so she would have more privilege than Sidni as a black woman, and that's not what I'm saying is here, but that's what critical race.
That's what it hails, yeah.
Exactly. And interest convergence, basically that any policy that is anti-racist, when you look through history, if you look at things like the civil rights in the 60s, that wasn't because people wanted to change civil rights. It was because people in power wanted to use that to give themselves more power. So basically every anti-racist policy is still based in power, not moral persuasion. And then the last thing is that everything should be centered on the voices of BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color. White people should be more or less silent in this. So it should just be Black people and people of color talking, and white people should be silent. So what I miss here? Anything, Sidni?
I don't think you missed anything. It's just, I almost wanted to laugh when you're going through that, because it's just so ridiculous. Like telling a group of people because of their skin color, you can't talk. Is that not racist? Like,
Interesting
Can
you
we,
say that
like-
because I wanted to actually, before we get started, because I think oftentimes people say this is racist or this is something. You use a word for it, but you don't define what that word means. So
Yeah.
I think I think to me, it's interesting. Like I think it'd be interesting to hear all of our definitions of what racism is. And what would be your definition, Sidni, starting out of what racism is?
I just think it's when you are discriminating against someone based on the color of their skin.
I think that's a good definition.
Yeah.
Gretchen?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. I think it can go even more into prejudice too, into that realm. Like if you don't want to just like cut it at that, I think it can go much wider. And even when you're thinking of systemic racism too.
What do you mean by
actually looked up-
prejudice?
So, taking like the color of their skin, but then not giving them something based on that, and maybe taking it further than just like a person to person action, but moving it into a practice by larger groups of people. That would be my thought about it. But
So it was interesting to me. I didn't realize the first time in the Oxford Dictionary that racism appeared was actually 1989.
that
And
late.
at that time, it said
interesting.
it was the theory that distinctive human characteristics and abilities are determined by race. The current definition in the Oxford Dictionary is the unfair treatment of people who belong to a different race or violent behavior towards them, and the belief that some races of people are better than others. So I think we all have pretty much. I mean, that I think that sums up my view of it as well. I think when you're treating someone based on the color of their skin, I think that to me is racism. So by that definition, Sidni, I tell me more why you think that this is all like this critical race theory is racist, because a lot of people would say that you can't be racist against white people. That's a pretty common saying. So do you disagree
But
with that? I'm guessing.
Well, yeah, I disagree with that because, I mean, you guys spoke about your backgrounds coming up, right? And one thing that you actually mentioned to me on the phone the other day, and I meant to like say it when you said it, but we started talking about something else, is like you said, oh, if there were two people, there's a white man and a black woman who are up for the same job and they had the same qualifications, I would hire the black woman. And I was immediately thinking about myself, and now I know your background, and I'm thinking like I had so much opportunity growing up. Like I've had a great family, you know, I've been to really cool places in the world, and you know, I live in a nice place. Like I've never lived in like a really like, for lack of a better word, crappy place, right? And if I didn't work that hard to get somewhere, let's say my dad or something called in and I had an interview somewhere, and then you're the other person who goes up and you've worked so hard. You came from where you came from and you're up for this job and you're here, you know, we both can present ourselves well. I would hope that the person who actually works super hard to get there would be the person who's hired, not the person who's a diversity hire. And I think that's my issue with critical race theory, is because it almost sort of sums up everyone's identity as their hindrance to success in society. And we don't think about maybe that person was lazy. Maybe that person did other things. Like it's all dependent upon skin color. And I just, you know, in my personal experience, like I said, I haven't lived an impoverished life. So I know for a fact that there have been times where I've gotten opportunities where I probably shouldn't have, you know, and people were nicer to me when they probably shouldn't have been, because I was being a dick, honestly. Like I went through a time, seriously, where I was a dick and I had a huge ego. And I think a lot of this talk with critical race theory and all this, it inflates the ego of people. I mean, obviously there are people who are my skin color who have not lived the best life, right? But to paint a broad stroke and say this is what the case is for all these people, it's just, it takes away their unique experience. It dehumanizes that individual. It dehumanizes white people. And I have such a heart for humans that I would never want to chalk everything up to what you look like, because what's your heart like? What are you working towards? Like, I want to know who you are. I look at your skin color, I'm like, okay, what else is there? You know?
Well, I didn't think I'd have to start out the episode by defending my progressive viewpoint on something, but I appreciate you. This is new for me. Usually I'm defending my conservative viewpoints, but I will say it's funny that you bring that up because, to be clear, if someone is better, I'm going to hire the better person. That's what we need to. We're a startup. We're trying to help people with disabilities where we don't have a lot of money to just throw away. So if there's a good person, we're going to hire them. The thing that it's not about, my motivation behind it wouldn't be for just helping someone of a different race because I feel bad for the race in general. It's more of, I do actually want diversity in thought. And I think I believe there are differences between the way men and women think in general. I think there's differences in experiences with Black people and white people and the way they grew up. And my life has been enhanced by my friends of color, not because the way they grew up, but I think in general, there's just, I think when you have diversity around you, it's a good thing. And so for me, the motivation wouldn't be like, I think that's the thing that I have a problem with. I think same as you, that when we start reducing people to their skin color and we start making decisions based only on that or primarily based on that, it kind of limits things. One example that I think I was talking to Gretchen about this, when Biden came into office and said that he was going to hire the most progressive cabinet in history, and very rarely did I hear this person is very well qualified. It was always about the different racial identity they had or gender identity. And it's tough because Biden has already said that if there's a Supreme Court opening, he's going to have the first Black woman Supreme Court justice. And it's interesting to me because I feel like if no matter who it is, if it's someone who, and I'm talking about the extremists, I'm not talking about the middle of the road, which I think are the majority of people who tend to be silent. But if you have a Black woman that comes in and you're an outspoken conservative, you're going to think, well, that they didn't really deserve the job. And it really limits. They could be the greatest justice. They could be the second coming of Clarence Thomas or Antonin Scalia and be this great conservative justice, and it'd still be like, well, yeah, but Biden said he was picking a Black woman. And on the flip side, that Black woman would come in and be like, you know what, I think slavery is actually good and we should change the law. And there'd be a lot of liberals that'd be like, yeah, like it's still a Black woman and it doesn't matter that you love slavery. It's the right, you're a liberal, you're a Black woman. And so I think that you're already putting these like an expectation on there that shouldn't be. I think it should be the best person for their job. So I agree. I do. I just wanted to clarify there that this isn't a Joe Biden kind of thing. It's more of, I just think that diversity in general is a good thing. So that's where I'm coming from with it. But
no,
Gretchen, any thoughts?
I totally see. Yeah.
Gretchen, if you were hiring a dancer, would you hire based on race?
It's interesting. I mean, well, what we're kind of going through right now in a lot of dance, money is being thrown more in the arts towards African Americans and the getting their art out there, just because it has been a white dominated art form for so long, especially Pittsburgh area. I'm like kind of living it right now. So it's there's more opportunity, but I am wonderfully happy about it because I think I don't know, I guess it's just because of the art form that I'm in and seeing the progression of it, and I'm at the point where I'm not performing as much anymore. I think probably if I was performing more and I wasn't getting hired and this was the reason, I probably might have a different opinion.
So that brings up an interesting question. I was watching a video when I was watching about critical race theory, and there's a woman, Kemi Badenoch. I may be pronouncing her name wrong, but she's a part of the English Parliament, and she did this video about critical race theory actually in front of Parliament. And one of the things she said, and this is going back to what you just said here, Gretchen, about historically it's been underrepresented. She said you can't improve history; you can only learn from it. And people are trying to go back and change history or make it better, but it's really some of the history is terrible. And I think that's a question to you. So Sidni, you seem to be to the right of me. So I would say I've seen friends of mine who are African American. I definitely have had a different experience. Like I know that, yes, I did grow up. There's friends of mine that grew up in a lot better household than I have, better families. They've had those advantages, but there are still a lot of things that I don't have to worry about as a white man that I have.
Like what?
So, I mean, getting pulled over is one of those things where I have, and I'll just put it this way, this isn't the generalized, all cops are bad and the entire system is racist, but I know that I have friends who grew up in really great households and have a fear of the police. And this isn't because of, you know, the way they grew up or the neighborhood they grew up. They grew up in really nice neighborhoods with good cops, and they are afraid to get pulled over. I got pulled over twice in 2 days last month, and both times I got out of the ticket. And it was like and we were laughing, we were joking, and I just, that's something that maybe that's me being biased by media, but I know, talking to my friends who are African American, I don't think that's a general experience of my friends of color who get pulled over, where you get let off. And then I think overall my record's about 8 for 10 in my life of getting off of speeding tickets or other traffic tickets. So it's a pretty different experience. And I guess my question to you is, have you experienced firsthand, I mean, racism growing up or currently? Is there something that, do you think there's actually some differences there, or is it all kind of a media narrative?
I think a lot of it is definitely a media narrative, because I mean, like, I'm sure that I've been in racist situations, but I mean, for the most part, if I was having any sort of discomfort, it was more so what was going on in my own head and like how I was thinking about the situation. And if you're thinking that a situation is going to be really bad, like, you know, it probably will be, especially if you're putting all this energy into those thoughts. That's what's going to happen. And I know for myself, I've never really thought about racism like that. Like, I've never been like, oh my gosh, these people are going to hate me because of my skin color. It's never been like that. If anything, it's been like self-hatred that I've had because of stuff that I've seen in the media, and the fact that I didn't grow up in a predominantly Black area. I grew up in a predominantly white area, and me having these thoughts and feelings that, oh my gosh, I'm not good enough because I'm not white. But that was me, right? That was me projecting onto the world, which was then projecting back onto me. And as soon as I started to change my own perceptions and beliefs about myself, my world started to change. You know, I realized that people are just, you know, they're just chilling. Like, they're just going about their days. They're mostly nice. I haven't had a bad situation with the cop ever, actually. And I know that my dad has gotten off of speeding tickets. I mean, he's a nice guy. So I think it's all about the energy that you're bringing into a situation. And I think if you look at any of the cases that have been made public in the past few years, the energy that many of those individuals were bringing into that situation was a negative energy. So it was only going to escalate. You know, like, if someone pulls me over and they say, if a cop pulls me over and says license and registration, I mean, okay, well, I'm going to have to pull out my license and registration. Like, I don't know what the issue is. Like, even if I think it's unfair or whatever, I'm just going to do what's said. And you know what? I'll either get a ticket or I'll be let go. And that's, I mean, I've only been pulled over once, but that's been my experience. So for you to, and I guess that's two people that you spoke to. But again, I think what gets lost here is, even if it's two people that you speak to, I like saying Black. I think African American, like, I know for myself, like, my mom was born in Jamaica. My dad was born here, but his family is from the Caribbean. They came here through Ellis Island. So I have like a very clear connection to my background. And I think this is another issue, right? We wash over a lot of people's lineage, and we assume that if you're Black or African American, whatever, that you came here on the slave boats. And there are a lot of people from Africa who literally are from the African continent, who come here, and they do better in America than the people who've been here. And why is that? It's the work ethic, it's the culture that they hail from. This is why I think a lot of these racial categories and a lot of these broad strokes that we paint don't actually help anyone.
No, I agree with you on that. And I think, I mean, I think even going back, it's one of those interesting stories to think about the history of America and South America. And I think, you know, South America has a very similar history with slavery and with the indigenous peoples versus Europeans who came over. But one of the things that seems to be great about South America in general is the fact that there was a documentary called Cuba Libre. If you ever get a chance to watch it, it's about how Cuba struggled through 8 different dictators to try to get their freedom, and it never seems to happen. They always have this like ability. But there was a guy in there that talked about the Black Cubans, because the Cubans, you know, there's some white people that came over, there's Black people, there's I think it was about 5% of the indigenous population were left, but he said, there's no difference. He's a scholar. He said there's no difference now in Cuba. We're all Cubans. We're not Black Cubans.
Yes.
We're not Afro-Cubans. We're not. And he said, from us, like it's all formed a part of who we are as Cubans. And he said, specifically, he was like, because of the Black Cubans, we had the people who came over on slave ships. They helped build this country, and they built a lot of our culture with dance and music. It's become a part of us. And I think it's a great outlook in general. And I think that's one of the things that, when you look overall, to me, critical race theory, I think, is assuming the worst to everybody. And I think there's the whole idea of, I'm trying to remember the other term. There's also another term that's basically post-racism. That's it. So post-racist theory is that eventually we'll get to that point where, like South America is. I mean, they still have issues, but in general, it's like we are now South Americans. We're Brazilian. We're Cuban. We're not African American or Afro-Cuban. We are Cubans. And to me, that's one of the things that's tough, because we talk a lot of times about being progressive, and Gretchen mentioned that she's progressive. And I think that when you look at a system that says this is all the bad stuff and this is all inertly racist and everything's racist and everyone's terrible, that seems regressive to me. Whereas let's try to shoot for moving forward. And I know there's issues. That's the thing. Like it's one of the, I forget which judge said it in the Supreme Court case, but they're talking about pornography, and they said, I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it. And there's been times where I've seen things that I'm like, okay, that's racist. And I know I've lived that and I've experienced it. But at the same time, I know from when I was younger until now, it's gotten a lot better. And I feel like we have, I mean, I think part of the problem I have with liberals and conservatives when you go to the extreme views is that a lot of times liberals kind of want to focus on, here's the bad, here's the history, you're never going to overcome it, everything is inherently bad. And conservatives are like, well, that was a long time ago. And then I'm like, well, we actually had segregation until like the 1960s. So it's not really that long ago. My grandparents were alive. Actually, my dad was alive. So it's not that long ago, and there's things that need to be fixed. But I think the goal should be not let's focus on all the terrible things. Let's focus on the fact that, there are countries that have done this well, and there's countries that don't look at it as different racial backgrounds. We're just Americans. And I don't know, that's the patriotic side of me. Like after something big happens with the country, I remember 9/11, we came together and we were Americans. And I think that's the last time we've actually been Americans. It's been 20 years now, and we just keep dividing. But I think with that being said, you did tell me you marched at like BLM protests. So what made you get involved in BLM protests and in that mindset? Because I also think, going back to Smith College, you had talked about how you said you were indoctrinated into that whole viewpoint. So do you want to talk a little bit about your background with some of the BLM protests and with some of your, as you called it, indoctrination?
Yeah, sure. So the Smith campus is a very politically active campus, but definitely only in one direction. It's very much influenced by the left. And I was never a super political person when I went into college. I was just like, oh, okay, like whatever, but I saw it everywhere around me, and like they had it on the bulletin boards and everything. And then you learn it in the classrooms, and you learn it from your fellow students. And it was just cool to hate on like the conservatives and like all that stuff. So I got involved.
It is actually cool. I mean, as a white male, I often feel like there's, we have a lot of jokes directed at us, and I feel very, very
triggered.
It's a trigger warning for me. It's a trigger warning. So in all fairness, we deserve most of it. But anyway, go ahead.
Did you just cut me off with your?
I did. Oh, sorry. Oh, geez.
How dare you? No, but
that's my privilege. That's my privilege. Yeah. I will be silent now. I will listen to the fourth thing, centering the voices of BIPOC people, and I will be silent the rest of this show. So go ahead, Sidni. It's your show now. Research and news.
I'm so happy we could joke about this, honestly. This is great. But so I got involved, and then I was in this class, and there was all that stuff going on with the Mizzou campus, and there was a lot going on in my personal life, and I ended up just being like watching the election that night in my dorm room with some of my friends, drinking wine. And I remember, like, as the vote starts rolling, we're like, no! The whole campus, kid you not, It was like a massive mourning. Everybody was in black. It was just like, you would have thought the world ended, but it was just that Donald Trump was elected, right? So I went down to Boston and I was like, hell no, he won't go. Whatever the chant is, I don't even really remember. But that was a low point in terms of my mental state, everything. I was completely demoralized. I didn't know where I was going. I was literally following all the other people because I wanted to be liked. I wanted all these things. So that's how I ended up there. And then, through healing work, a lot of healing work, I came to my own opinions and aligned with people who really fit the world I wanted to see. And that's kind of how I was there.
Wow. Well, I feel like this is twice now on this show, though, after that dialogue there, that I felt I never feel uncomfortable. And when you asked me about racism and you had a look in your eyes that was like an angry look at me, I was like, oh, I feel a little uncomfortable. Now I got to hit this. I got to answer this properly. And then even though I knew you were joking, there's still a part of me like, oh no, I just interrupted her. Like, what am I think I just got canceled. Sidni just canceled me. So good job already making me feel very uncomfortable twice. So it's very rare that people can do that. But
that's where you get the juice, right? You have to get people in an uncomfortable place. I like when people make me uncomfortable because I'm like, all right, how can I spin this and do something? Make a joke? I don't know.
So now we actually have a question coming in from the audience here and talks about equity. So there's a new term going around, equity versus equality. I'd be interested to hear your definition of it because I think Gretchen and I actually just talked about this recently, kind of on a side note, not specifically in relation to this conversation, but we just talked about this. Yeah. What is your thoughts on the difference between equity and equality, and where do you stand on that? Because that is the new buzzword right now, and I don't think many people know what the buzzword means.
Honestly, I've been trying to figure this out because I had a conversation with my mom and my sister and they were like, equity, we want equity. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So I'm probably not the person to ask. I mean,
have you seen the cartoon of the equity versus equality?
Yes. Where they
the three
boxes.
people.
Yes,
and then,
the boxes. And
if you guys haven't seen the video, or go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that it was funny because I saw another comment on that, and they were like, they all didn't pay for the baseball game. They were all trying to see it for free.
I never thought of that.
Funny.
Wow, that's actually for the audience.
Like, yes.
If you haven't seen the cartoons, basically three people that are all standing on a box trying to look over a fence at a baseball game. And one person is shorter, one person's medium height, one person's tall. So even though they're all on a box, they still can't see. And equity, so that equality was giving everyone the same box, whereas equity is having one of the boxes be higher so the shorter person can see. That's an interesting perspective that they're all trying to see something they didn't pay for. My first thought, as someone who does tend to be someone who, again, leans libertarian, was like, why don't we just get rid of the stupid fence? I think that's just a representation of, all right, so why are we putting the fences there? Why don't we let just people have their own abilities to overcome things instead of saying, here's a box? But basically, to me, the difference between equity and equality, the way it's being promoted, and this is my view on what it is that equality is making sure that everyone has the same opportunities. Equity seems to be, if you are someone of color, the assumption is that you had a tougher time in life, and so we're going to give you more. So it's kind of, what was it? Not Title IX. For education? There's the whole. This is really killing the podcast right here. Someone's gonna help me out with this. What's the term? There's a term for when you're helping people based on race, and I forget what it's called, but it's something similar to that, where we're gonna give you advantages because of your race. Or because of your gender. And so not equal opportunity. I'm going to skip past it, and I'm sure everyone out there is yelling at their microphones and their
affirmative action.
Affirmative action. Boom.
Yes!
Thank you. Sidni gets the point.
Why was I just here like, what? I don't know.
Sidni gets the point.
I was trying so hard. I was like,
And I think one of the things I have a problem with that is in general, I think that what it seems like we're trying to do is switch from equality of opportunity to equality of outcomes. And that's always going to be difficult to me. And I think I'd actually like to hear Gretchen's point of view on this one, because I think that's a big thing where for a lot of times, even when I look at engineers, a lot of people will say, how many women have you hired? We haven't. We hired one woman, which we still haven't hired that many male engineers, but we had one woman who we had to let go quickly because she was just bad at her job. But people are like, well, you should be when we get interviews, when we do job postings, we'll have 70, 80, 90% males come in. So it's something where, like, I think right now we're trying to do all these things where it's like, well, we need to hire females, but it's like, well, we should really be focusing on, in childhood education, let's focus more on STEM for women. That's the thing for me, where it's like, we can't fix the problems we already had. It's just like what that woman said. It's tough you can't improve history. You can only learn from it. So my view is, okay, let's start focusing some of that funding on, early education for women and encouraging STEM programs, instead of saying, all right, well, you need to hire more women engineers. It's like, well, if we had more engineers applying, we would do that. But Gretchen, I mean, I'd like to hear your view, since you're clearly the more progressive one of the three of us. What's your view on opportunity, equity, any of the things we just talked about here?
I feel like it's such a heavy topic, because when you look at, I mean, I taught at a college, I taught at many colleges for a long time. So I was seeing a lot of students come in that didn't have the opportunities, and they wouldn't have been able to be there to better their lives if they wouldn't have had the opportunity. And nobody was turned away because they got the opportunity. So I think my experiences in watching students get the opportunity to come to school, and seeing people, helping them through the process to help them learn and grow. I don't know. I think it's kind of shaped my opinion to, maybe I like the idea of giving people opportunities when you know that they haven't come from a place, and so these students were coming from inner city, big cities in Maryland, Baltimore, and stuff like that, where they come from schools where they weren't getting the greatest education, but they came on like a football scholarship, and they were getting an opportunity to come to a college that was a really, really good college, and having mentors within the college help them through and navigate education on a level that they had never done. So I think watching students go through that, I mean, I feel like people getting an opportunity that they wouldn't get is really important. I know it's like the equality versus equity is a hard thing to navigate, because it's like, how do you judge somebody that has, like, maybe like Sidni, like, that had all these opportunities, like, and you don't know. So it's like, do you ask that? You can't really ask that. So it's like,
why can't you, though?
Yeah, I mean,
why can't you?
I think most people would be like, oh, poor me. If I'm going to get a football scholarship, I mean, even if I wasn't poor, or if I was going to get some kind of scholarship, I'd be like, oh yeah, I was really poor. Like, just give me that money. Yeah. Like,
right.
Yeah. I have friends now even that are really against the whole bailout, and they're like, this is going to bankrupt us, but how do I get my money? It's like, that's what we do. We're all selfish people. But I think one of the things you said there, Gretchen, I think that, to me, I think, again, I look for solutions that are long-term. And when I look at, oftentimes, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, they're all Band-Aid solutions that don't really fix any problem. And I think the key word to what you said, where I think there's the common ground in different viewpoints, is mentorship. And I think that's something for me that, like, if it wasn't for the mentors in my life, I mean, I didn't have the opportunity. I had a grandfather who was amazing. And I had a few other people in my life, one woman in particular, and two men that just have really bought into my life and taught me a lot. And if it wasn't for them, I don't know where I'd be. And even my best friend and his family, they are an amazing family. They are just, I look at it and I go, wow. Like, I actually asked him, we were on a phone call with some of the family a couple weeks ago, and I said afterwards, do you ever fight? And he was like, ever? And he was like, I don't think so. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, my family, it's like, if we could make it through like one holiday without 7 fights, it's amazing. And it's like, so I have these people around me that have had really great experience, and I'm able to learn from them. And I think when we go back to what we initially talked about with, fiscal responsibility, to me, it's not avoiding spending money. It's, all right, how do we find mentorship in high schools? And how do we start at an early age and not say now, okay, let's fix the problems by making these opportunities here. If we're going to give people mentorship and actually help them, I'm all for that. But if we're just saying, all right, we're going to try to fill these boxes and fit these quotas, that's where it gets a little bit tricky for me. And I think we have to start that, though. It's more of a long-term solution, is starting it in elementary schools and high schools. And a lot of the kids I worked with at the nonprofit I worked at, they didn't know how to open up bank accounts, and they didn't, stuff that I didn't know how to do either if it wasn't for my grandfather. It wasn't for people who bought into my life. And I think that's something that should be taught in schools. We should talk about life skills. We should talk about having mentors in schools. And on the
financial
flip side
literacy.
too, yeah, exactly. have a Dave Ramsey class in the middle of public schools. I don't know if that'd be allowed, but on one flip note, and something that you said earlier, Sidni, and I think this is something that when you asked about racism in general and things I've seen, I'll never forget this conversation I had with a kid. I don't want to mention his name. He actually passed away in gun violence. And he was my toughest kid. I worked at a place in Florida as well called Urban Youth Impact, and I worked in an after-school setting. And my theory was anytime I had to discipline a kid, I would go and talk to them separately, because oftentimes it'd be acting up in class and then it was just a bad scene. And so I'd always take him aside and walk with him. And there was this one kid, we'll call him Sidney, just as a made up name. Now that'll be confusing. But we went out, we would always go and talk. And at the time, I think he was 13 years old. And at one point, it got back to me that he said he was going to put out a hit on me with one of the gangs. And I thought it was kind of funny at first, because I was like, okay, really? This is a 13-year-old kid. Then I found out, 2 years later, he went to jail for doing a drive-by. That was his first time in prison. But every time we'd go out and walk around, when it was one-on-one, he was an amazing kid. He was very friendly. One day we were talking about what he wanted to do in life. He said he wanted to be a fireman. There was a woman that was unloading her car. She was a teacher there. And I was going to say, hey, we should go help her out. And he was like, Mr. Ray, should we go help her? I was like, yeah, let's go do that. And we went over and we helped her out. And one of the things that affected me a lot from talking with him was, at one point I was talking about school in one of these talks, and he said that his guidance counselor had told him that he should just drop out because it'd be better for him. And this is a 12, 13-year-old kid.
Why is that person a guidance counselor?
I have no idea. But it was something that wasn't uncommon. And I think that's something maybe, since you didn't grow up in a setting like that, that's something, I think it does go beyond just race. But unfortunately, when you look at a lot of inner cities, it's primarily black kids and people of color. And so it is, I think, more prevalent. And so that's one of those situations where it's like, what is involved in that? Is it systemic? Is it just individual racism? But at the core of it, it's like, I feel terrible for him. And 2 years later, he's in jail for doing a drive-by. He got out, was out of jail for 2 years, and then he ended up getting shot and killed. And there's actually a picture of him and I, and this is just some of that ridiculousness, but there's a picture of him and I from Facebook a long time ago. It just popped up, and he told me to do gang signs for a picture, and I just did something with my hands. I don't know. I was like Will Ferrell and Talladega Nights, and then I looked and I was like, oh no, he actually had real gang signs there. I looked it up. I actually, but that's one of those times it just breaks my heart. But I think that's where the key is. We have to start, and that school is overpopulated. There's not a lot of teachers there per student, and I think in general that's where we need real mentorship and real guidance. And that's what I'm all about. Let's get rid of the Department of Education from a national level and put that money towards mentorship in schools. That to me is a fiscal policy that actually I would get 100% behind, and stop wasting our money on a national government standard and get to that individual level.
But also on top of that, I think another issue with regard to that is a lot of the kids, if they come from a bad neighborhood, if they live in the inner city, they're almost forced to go to that school. They can't even get a voucher. That's why I really do support school choice, because then the parent could say, but then the other issue is the parent super involved in their child's life? So that's a whole other thing. But at least in that situation, the parent could be like, this school sucks. I'm going to put you in a school in this neighborhood using this voucher, and you'll get better education. And I know for myself, I want to preface this, I do not speak for anybody except myself. Right. I've had a very unique experience. I think we all have, all of us, regardless of, where we came from. And I think one of my biggest issues today is that I feel like whenever a person of color speaks, they equate it as the dominant thoughts of all people of color. And I just really want to hit that. I want to get rid of that, because I'm only speaking for myself. I know that I haven't lived a stereotypical life. And I also realize that some of the things that I'm probably presenting is coming from a place of privilege myself. So I'm very aware of that. And, a lot of my views have been formed because of that. And I can't really go back. I can only move forward. And I realized that, when I did have interactions with people, Black people in the hood and stuff like that, it was when I was going to get my hair done or something like that. So it was a very different experience, and I was able to see it and then leave. And hearing about what people are talking about, what they care about. I remember a lady who used to do my hair. She had 5 kids. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the projects, like in a neighboring place. And she was a smart woman, like she'd watch news and she cared about things, and she would complain about the lack of resources in the schools. And she would also talk about some of the people in her building who were living off of welfare. So they kept popping out kids so that they could get more welfare checks. So like there's always 2 sides or multiple sides to every story. And for that kid, it's like, it's sad because he obviously didn't have mentors, but I think the culture also failed him, because I'm sure when he watched TV and other things like that, he was seeing these things glorified and he wanted to be cool, right? And I think that's the issue, even with a lot of these outcomes that we want to change. Like you mentioned the STEM, right? It's been shown that even though there has been more resources put towards STEM programs, women predominantly go towards more healing professions, whether that's dancing, whether that's being a teacher, whether that's doing all these things. Obviously, there are women in tech. I mean, Whitney with Bumble, I think that's her name, Whitney.
I think so, yeah. The billionaire,
Yeah.
the Bumble billionaire, yeah.
Yeah, the Bumble billionaire. Like, she just did an awesome thing, but it's like, we can't force outcomes at the end of the day. Like, we can only help people who want to be helped. And I think it's really identifying those individuals who want more, right? And providing those opportunities if they don't have them at their immediate disposal, whereas, other people might.
Right. Well, I think a couple of things, notes I made here. Number one, I do speak for all white men. So you may not speak for all black women, but I have taken the mantle that in this podcast, I am speaking for all black or all white. Jeez, I thought it was black for a second there. And I will say, you did bring up hair. This is probably reverse racism, but I've never met a white barber that cuts hair as well as a black barber. So it's really not, that's something that like white people really need to figure out. This is totally off
You've
topic.
never met my barber.
Yeah, I was going to say, yours is pretty good. Yours is pretty good.
Shout out to Ted, Morgantown, West Virginia.
Nice. Yeah. So I'll tell you guys
Although I've been doing this myself.
Wow, that's impressive too.
Thanks.
This is off topic, but this is I feel like this is an important thing to talk about right now when we talk about race. I got to tell you, I've never felt more uncomfortable as when I was at a barber shop and I saw there was 2 white guys, barbers, and 1 black guy. And every time I saw the black guy giving a haircut, it was so much better than the guy that I went to go see. And I decided one time to switch to go to that barber. And I've never cheated on anyone, but I know how it feels now and it's like sitting there in that barber chair while the other guy was like, "Oh, I'm ready for you," and I was like, "Oh, actually, I'm going to him." And the look on his face was like, I just broke their heart. It was amazing. How tough that was.
You kind of did cheat on him. I
Yeah,
mean,
you
that's
did.
really you legit did.
I mean, and I cheated on him like right in front of him. I was like, "Here's my new partner." It was rough. But something, and going back to what you said, Sidni, I'm all for, this is one of those times where I think it's a bit of a struggle for me because I am all for school vouchers, but I still think the issue there is like, I don't necessarily think it's a race issue. I know Biden came out this week with the whole, what did he say? It's hard to get vaccines if you're black or brown because you can't.
It's use a computer. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I just don't. I don't
know how I'm on here right now. Honestly.
Yeah, I'm glad you could manage to get on the air, but. I think at the core of it, it's if you grow up in poverty, whether you're black, white, whatever race you are, I think that's part of the problem is that like you talk about people on welfare and people kind of it's just like the system where it encourages people to stay there as opposed to getting out of it. And that's what I want to, like, again, that goes back to me having a conservative viewpoint on fiscal spending. It's not let's get rid of welfare. It's all right, let's spend money on job training. Let's spend money on mentorship. Let's spend money on teaching people why school vouchers may actually work. And a good friend of mine who actually brought up a good point. We were talking about school systems, and he comes from more of a liberal background, liberal perspective, but brought up something I'd never thought of before. And he talked about how school choice, it's tough for some of the same reasons. Like people that are going to take advantage of it typically know that it's a benefit and it's going to be unfairly distributed. But the problem we have now is that, like, I mean, if you look in Pennsylvania, there's school districts that you could name Fox Chapel and some of these really nice school districts that have amazing facilities and beautiful areas. And the guy I was talking to happens to be black, and he also went to a very nice school. And he said, for people that I went to school with, they have their kids that go to that same school, and then they succeed, and then their kids succeed. And when you're stuck in a system that has bad education, then you end up having kids that weren't educated well and stay in the same system and keep repeating itself. And he brought up the idea of having a central system for the whole state where every school gets the same amount of money, the same amount of teachers. And I am not generally, smaller government the better is my mantra, but when it comes to the school system, I was like, oh, wait a second, that really makes sense.
That is what when you guys were talking about everything, that is what because I live in a neighborhood right now that is very white, and it's very, our taxes are incredibly high. I was in shock actually when I moved in and I bought the house, and I was like, but it's like, but I know that it's like, so when you look at like East Liberty, like in Pittsburgh, is like this much lower income area, their school district is not as good as Shaler, where I live. So it's like, you're looking at these two places, and if you have like a voucher program, like of course everybody's going to try to leave. So then what happens to that school, right? So then those kids that can't get vouchers, they're even more in trouble, so it's like, I like the idea of vouchers, but I don't think in practice right now with the way everything is and the way that taxes, like property taxes, is how all of our schools are funded. It seems it's just not going to work in a practical sense.
On that point, though, I think that's kind of like the free market deciding that these schools aren't good and they need to close, and there needs to be a new one that opens. That's kind of how I think. If all the kids are taking their voucher and going to the better schools, obviously this school sucks. Obviously, it probably needs to be shut down. A new one needs to be created, and I think that's how you cycle out things that are bad.
I wonder,
I'm
though,
with
like,
you,
why does
except
it
for the
suck,
fact
though?
that, I mean, number one, why does it suck? Probably because they aren't getting the funding. And the problem is those kids that are caught up in that in between. It's like, I'm all for. I did not think I would be the, I didn't think I'd be the middle voice here. I thought I'd be more of the, have to tone down my conservative viewpoints. But I feel like the problem with that, to me, when it comes to kids, like there's something about me that I've often talked about with people will talk about that I have empathy and because of the way I grew up, but I have a lot of empathy for people who don't know how to do better or are trying to get better and just fail. The kids I worked with at Urban Impact, anytime, if they kept messing up over and over and over again, I didn't care as long as they're trying to get better. But I don't have a lot of care and concern for people who just aren't trying. I managed to find my way out of tough situations, and it doesn't mean everyone can, but I work with people with disabilities. That's not a choice. It's something that happened, and I want to make sure that we help them. But that's my heart goes out. And we had actually talked about this when our brief conversation on Friday. I mentioned something about how some feelings are involved in political decisions, and to me it's mostly logic and a little bit of feelings. And you gave me a look kind of like you did earlier on this call today. But I think that's the part where feelings come in for me, where it's like, all right, well, I totally am a free market guy. I think that's the way the economy should run. But when it comes to those kids, like, I would feel terrible for, like, all right, well, let's just wait. Like, the kids that are left, they'll struggle. So I think that's where you got to try to find a system that fixes it from the beginning and weeds out the problem. Because, if all the kids leave and go to the better school, then all those kids that are left are going to have even worse educations, and it's tough. So
that's why
it's a tough topic, and I think this is good that we're talking about it.
Yeah, well, that's why I was saying, like, the school would close, and like those the students who are left, they would go to better schools, basically. That's what I'm saying. You'd weed out the really bad schools so that no kids would have to be in them anymore.
I think you just went with no kid left behind. I feel like you should be part of the Bush administration. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm totally with you. It's those kids that in between, like, those schools aren't going to close automatically. They're going to be some kids are left over, and that's.
I think logistically, it would be a difficult.
Like I said, that's where my heart always goes out for them. That's the. I just want to show on this podcast how empathetic I am, and just like Gretchen's humble brag earlier about being the head cheerleader. Yeah. No. I'm definitely not Antifa like you, so that's not. That's not where we're going.
I'm not getting Antifa vibes. I have to stick up for Gretchen here.
No.
I'm not getting those vibes.
I'm pretty sarcastic, so I feel like that's something I should have said earlier in this show.
He gives me a lot of crap.
I'm just trying to stick up for you, Gretchen.
I appreciate it.
There it is. The women against the men. We're in the minority again.
It's on, right?
Exactly.
Here we go. It's just the way it's life is for me. It's tough as a white male. So.
Man.
Oh my gosh,
All right.
It's too funny.
Well, I think we've had I think this has been a very interesting first podcast for Research the News, and I think I want to start wrapping up here. But before we go, something we're going to do in every episode of Research the News is talk about what's something you guys learned today and what's next. So if you just want to go through, I'll start with Sidni. What's something you learned today from either us or just something that you maybe thought of differently yourself? And what's something we've talked about a lot of topics, but what's something that you think going forward we can all learn something from and say, hey, if we're talking about critical race theory, school systems, here's a plan for how we can make one of these things better.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I learned is that I'm definitely a lot more conservative than I thought. But I also learned that I mean, I love talking to people. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what your views are. As long as it's respectful, like, let's talk. And I think moving forward, we all need to do that. We all need to just hear people out, because you never know, like, you can't get triggered if you just hear one thing. I think when you start to listen to people and you start to hear more about their background, then you can understand how they form their opinions, and it humanizes the individual that you're talking to, so that you're not going to be like, I'm going to cancel them, because now it's like, wait, I know too much about you to cancel you. And that's what we need more of.
I love it. Gretchen, you're up. What did you learn? What's next?
You know what, one thing that it's not that I learned it, it's that I realized it. When we were kind of getting prepped for this, I started reaching out to people, because I was like, okay, I kind of know some stuff about this, but I kind of wanted to hear from people. And I think we go through, especially like social media life, like you're seeing things and you're digesting this stuff that you keep seeing, but you stop connecting with the people that are writing it. And I started reaching out. And so, like, I have a friend that went to Smith. One of my former students came back, and he's a mentor at the college level for Black students coming. So he was the guy I was talking about. And so reaching out to people in my own sphere, but even then, some people that I don't necessarily 100% agree with. So there's people in that group that I can utilize and hear more from them. And I agree with you. I feel like when we get online, we lose humanity with people. And I've taken a step back from Facebook. Well, first of all, Facebook, but I like have really taken a step back, just because I was losing faith in people that I was coming into contact with online, just because even my people that I love and that are a lot like me, just because of the way they spoke to people. And I think it's when you're online, you lose that humanity, and you can't hear when someone's being sarcastic. Right.
There should really be, if there's one thing we can do next, it's to make a sarcasm font. So I feel like that would be
that'd be great.
That'd be really helpful for me.
I would, because it would happen to me very often. Like, I would be really sarcastic with people, and they would get so mad. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm kidding. Oh my gosh. Like, I'm like totally abort. Yeah. So, but I mean, okay. So going forward, I want to make a sarcastic font.
I think sarcastic. So, geez, I was going to say humanize people, and then Sidni stole that. And then I threw the sarcastic font out there too soon. So, I will say that, what did anyone learn? I mean, the thing I learned the most is that people can still make me uncomfortable. Sidni, I think you should be a teacher, because you have that look that can I feel like you'd be a good teacher. That look right there. There's not many times I feel uncomfortable, but I think going back to what you said though,
you've never made me mad. I also get that look, because I'm sure I will. We have plenty of time. So
I will say though that I think growth comes from being uncomfortable, and I think that's the same way when it comes to I mean, even comedy today, it's just like, it's so watered down and boring. It's not edgy. There's nothing. I feel like we grow in the uncomfortable moments, and I think that's something that we're really missing. And even me, I mean, that's something that I will actually leave here, and that's probably something I'll think about, that interaction, and say, what made me uncomfortable? And I think that's something I'm going to keep going with. What's good. Next is the sarcasm font. For sure.
Let's get a petition going.
Yeah.
It needs to happen.
We have to do it.
I think we'll write to Apple, and we'll tell them that they're racist if they don't do the sarcasm font. They'll do it immediately. We're also going to finish up here. Just one good thing. We want to make this quick. Just something that people can, fun fact you may have learned in the past week. Just one good thing, because I mean, oftentimes in these conversations they may get tough. Today was fun, but I'm sure there'll be some tough conversations, and we're just going to end with that. So, anything you want to end with on a good note, Sidni? Anything positive for people to check out, or anything interesting you've learned this week outside of this?
I will say it's always darkest before the dawn, and it's been pretty dark. So what we have to look forward to is the dawn. Also, the days are getting longer.
Yes.
Summer's approaching. So there really is so much to be happy about. And the best thing about everything that's going on right now is what was in the dark is now being brought to light. And that's how you solve issues, is when you actually know about them.
I love it. Gretchen?
No, I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, I will say something. This is just a random funny note that actually leads into my last comment for the day. I'd already talked to both of you about this, but I learned. So I'm reading or listening to a podcast called Revolutions. If you guys have a chance to listen to it, it's amazing. Guy who hosts it goes through famous historical revolutions, and I've just learned so much from it. But he talked about a guy in South America who took the name Tupac Amaru from the original Tupac Amaru, who was the last Incan monarch. And so I was like, wait a second. And he didn't mention anything about Tupac. I'm sure this guy probably doesn't know who Tupac Shakur is, apparently. He's a historian, not up on culture. But I looked it up, and apparently something else new I learned was that Tupac was actually born Lassane Parish Crooks. And then at age 1, his name was changed to Tupac Amaru. He was named after the last Incan monarch because his mom, Afeni Shakur, was actually a Black Panther and wanted him to have a revolutionary name. So not only was he named after this monarch, but he was named at 1 year old. He was changed over to that name. So that's my interesting fact. I love Tupac. I think he is the greatest philosopher in the 1900s. And apologies to Jody Shaw, by the way, because we didn't actually talk about Jody Shaw, and that was kind of the whole point of the beginning of this. But I do want to end.
Shout out to Jody, though.
Shout out to Jody. Maybe we'll have Jody on in the future. In the last version of Research and News, every episode I ended with a Tupac quote, and I wasn't sure if I was going to keep doing that, but I think going back to the greatest philosopher in history, I think this is actually a good quote to end this with. It's from Ghetto Gospel, and he says in there, "When you wipe your eyes, see it clearly. There's no need for you to fear me. If you take your time and hear me, maybe you can learn to cheer me. It ain't about black or white, because we human." And I feel like that right there is post-racist theory. That's when we move past it, and it's not about black or white. We're all human. So hopefully that's what we can get to. And I think it starts with conversations and humanizing people and recognizing the legitimacy of what other people say. So thank you, Gretchen, for co-hosting. Sidni, thanks for being on the first show, being our guinea pig. So we appreciate that. Anything
you guys are fun, by the way. You guys are awesome. I don't understand why you can't talk.
Well, I want to thank you guys for being on here. I want to thank the people who watched, and we'll be posting this up on the podcast tomorrow. It'll officially go live as the podcast, and we'll be reposting it to YouTube. But we're looking forward to doing these on Sunday nights. So we're just gonna grow this until my goal eventually. No, I think I may have told you guys this individually, but I'm gonna say this now, and everyone's gonna laugh. But someday my goal is to have a podcast with Barack Obama and Donald Trump. I want to moderate the two of them. I feel like I want to get them in a room, and I feel like that would be that's the Research the News end goal. So I want to get those two men in a room. But all right, so share this podcast. I'm going to sign off with our guests now. Thank you very much for being here, and looking forward to seeing you again next week. And this was Research the News.